The automatic camera clicked rhythmically as Major Robert Cowboy Stout's F-6F Hellcat sliced through the air 8,000 feet above the island of Peleliu. It was September 12, 1944, just 3 days before one of the most brutal battles of the Pacific War. His orders were routine: fly over the northern airfield, take reconnaissance photos, and return to the carrier-ass Hornet. Intelligence had assured him the strip was a wasteland bombed flat, abandoned, nothing but smoking wreckage left behind. But when Stout banked left and looked down through the cockpit glass, his stomach turned to ice. The airfield wasn't empty. It was alive. Below him, the tarmac shimmered with movement mechanics running between rows of aircraft, fuel trucks rumbling over the dirt, men in white coveralls loading bombs under wings. And not just a handful. The place was packed. Mitsubishi Zeros, Nakajima bombers, dozens of them lined up wingtip to wingtip, so close together their shadows overlapped. Fuel drums sat stacked in neat, careless rows beside them. It was an arsenal waiting to explode. He counted fast. 20, 30, 40 aircraft. All fueled, all armed, and all aimed at the same target he knew was coming. In 72 hours, 28,000 US Marines would hit the beaches of Peleliu. Their transports and landing craft were already on the move, slow, exposed, and vulnerable. These Japanese planes were perfectly positioned to tear that fleet apart before the first Marine even reached shore. Stout's hand tightened on the control stick. He knew what he was supposed to do. His training was drilled into him like scripture: observe, report, return. A reconnaissance pilot's job wasn't to fight, especially not alone against a full airfield crawling with enemy gunners. His duty was to take the pictures, radio the coordinates, and let command handle it. But Stout also knew how the system worked. By the time he landed, briefed intelligence, and command assembled a strike package, it would be too late. The Japanese would disperse their planes into revetments, hide them under camouflage, or worse, launch them toward the invasion fleet. The men on those ships didn't have hours. They didn't have the luxury of military procedure. They had days, maybe minutes, depending on what he did right now. Stout eased the throttle back and climbed higher, studying the field below through his gun sight. The Japanese had made a fatal mistake. They'd packed their aircraft too tightly and surrounded them with rows of exposed fuel drums. One spark could turn that entire airstrip into an inferno. He checked his gauges. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns. 2,400 rounds. 12 seconds of continuous fire. That was all. Not nearly enough to destroy 40 aircraft, but maybe enough to light the fuse that would. For a moment, he just hovered there above the island, engine droning steady, heart pounding. He imagined the landing fleet. Wave after wave of Marines huddled in landing craft, packed shoulder to shoulder, every man depending on the air cover that might never come if he failed. He'd seen what happened when air superiority slipped. He'd been at Tarawa, circling helplessly while Japanese bombers tore into the first assault wave, setting landing craft ablaze before they reached shore. He'd seen men jumping into burning water, waving for help that never came. Not again, he thought. Not if I can stop it. He took a deep breath. The Hellcat's cockpit was small as steel cage, rattling with vibration. He could feel the warmth of the Pacific sun on his helmet, the faint smell of oil and sweat filling the cabin. Through the glass, the airfield shimmered like a trap waiting to spring. He knew what attacking would mean. The instant he dove, every anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu would lock on him. Alone, with no wingmen to cover his flank or draw fire, it would be suicide. But if he did nothing, if he simply turned away, then those planes would rise into the sky and slaughter the Marines who trusted his photographs to keep them safe. The choice was clear. He pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared like thunder. The Hellcat rolled gracefully into a dive. The altimeter began to unwind, faster and faster, as the island rushed up toward him. He cut through a thin layer of cloud, the air vibrating against the canopy. The jungle canopy below spread out like an endless carpet of green, dotted with flashes of sun. His plan was simple. Come in low and fast, hit the fuel drums first, and get out before the gunners could react. At 2,000 feet, he leveled out. The trees became a blur. His airspeed climbed past 300, then 350, the roar of the engine deafening. 50 feet above the treetops now. The airstrip appeared suddenly through a break in the jungle, a strip of sunlit grey dotted with Japanese aircraft. Ground crews looked up, confused, unsure what they were seeing. Some froze. Others pointed. No one reached their guns in time. Stout's thumb pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 Brownings opened fire in unison. The sound was a furious metallic roar, a heartbeat of thunder that filled the cockpit. Tracers tore across the tarmac, slicing through the thin aluminum skin of a Zero. The fighter shuddered, wings folding under the hail of bullets, fuel spraying into the air like mist. Stout adjusted his aim slightly and raked the stream of fire toward a stack of fuel drums sitting between 2 bombers. The drums burst apart instantly, their contents vaporizing into a sheet of flame. Then the airfield erupted. The explosion was far larger than he expected. A shockwave slammed into his aircraft, the flash of light so bright he had to squint behind his goggles. Flames shot 50 feet into the air. The burning Zero beside the drums ignited, and that fire leapt to another, then another. Within seconds, half the row was ablaze. From above, it looked like a fuse being lit across the airfield. Stout pulled hard on the stick, climbing fast. The Hellcat groaned in protest as it gained altitude. Behind him, the entire northern section of the runway was consumed in a rolling curtain of fire. Below, chaos reigned. Japanese ground crews were running in every direction, some diving for cover, others trying desperately to unchain aircraft and taxi them away from the flames. It was too late. The inferno was spreading faster than anyone could react. Tracer fire streaked up from the ground late, wild, panicked. He felt the thump of rounds striking the fuselage, saw sparks flash along the wing. But the Hellcat kept climbing, its massive radial engine screaming with power. He leveled out above the smoke, heart pounding, the smell of cordite thick in his nostrils. Below him, the airfield looked like a vision from hell-black smoke boiling upward, aircraft silhouettes twisting in the flames, fuel drums detonating one after another. He'd come to take photographs. Instead, he'd just started a chain reaction that could save an invasion. Tracers streaked past Stout's canopy in glowing arcs, slicing through the thin morning haze. He felt the sharp shudder of impacts along the fuselage, the dull metallic thump of 20 mem rounds punching through his tail section. The Hellcat lurched violently to one side, but the big Pratt and Whitney engine kept roaring, strong and defiant. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure low, oil temperature rising. But the plane was still alive, and so was he. Stout banked hard to the right, climbing out of range. As he broke through the column of smoke, he glanced down and for the first time, truly saw what he had done. Below him, the northern half of the airfield was gone. Dozens of aircraft were burning in an unbroken chain of fire. Flames leapt from plane to plane, fuel tanks bursting in bright orange flashes. The heat distorted the air above the runway, making the scene ripple like a fever dream. Black smoke rolled into the sky, visible for miles. He had expected destruction, but not this. And yet, as his eyes scanned the southern end of the strip, his stomach sank. At least 20 more aircraft sat untouched, perfectly lined up and waiting. Zeros, bombers, twin-engine reconnaissance planes all ready to launch. It wasn't finished. Not yet. He checked his ammunition counter. Half empty. Maybe 6 seconds of firing time left. That was all. Below, the anti-aircraft gunners were ready now. He could see them running into position, smoke still rising from the guns they had just manned. They knew he would come back. And he knew it too. Coming around for a second pass was suicide. But turning back wasn't an option. He rolled the Hellcat inverted and dove again, sun flashing across the canopy. This time the flak came instantly furious, precise, relentless. Tracers ripped through the air like red lightning. The sky seemed alive with fire. Stout jinked left, then right, throwing the Hellcat into erratic movements, trying to spoil the gunner's aim. The aircraft groaned under the strain, the wings flexing dangerously. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the cockpit. A sudden burst of flak exploded close off his left wing, rocking the plane hard. A sheet of shrapnel tore through the rear fuselage with a screech of metal. He didn't have time to check the damage. He came in from a new angle, low and fast, the treetops a green blur beneath him. His crosshairs found the southern row a cluster of bombers parked beside a line of fuel trucks and stacked ammunition crates. He pressed the trigger. The 6 Brownings roared again, a deep vibrating thunder that shook the entire airframe. Tracers poured downward, ripping into the bombers' wings and engines, tearing through aluminum skin like paper. He swept the stream of fire across the line of aircraft, then onto the fuel truck. The truck disappeared in a single blinding flash. The explosion hit like a hammer. The shockwave slammed against his canopy, and a sphere of orange fire consumed everything nearby. One bomber flipped onto its back from the blast, wings snapping as it rolled. Then came the chain reaction. Fuel from the ruptured truck flowed like liquid fire, racing across the tarmac. It reached the ammunition crates, and the world below him erupted in a rapid series of white-hot bursts. Bombs, fuel, and munitions went off together in deafening succession, each blast feeding the next. The entire southern half of the airfield vanished into flame. For a moment, it was hard to tell where the explosions ended and the sky began. Stout pulled up, the stick heavy in his hands. His guns fell silent, the ammunition drums empty. Every round spent. The Hellcat felt sluggish now, wounded and weary. The right aileron barely responded. Something was leaking behind him, leaving a thin trail of smoke. The hydraulic lines groaned, making every movement a battle. He didn't care. The job was done. Below, the airfield was a furnace. Every plane, every structure, every fuel dump gone. The fire stretched from end to end, a continuous inferno spewing black smoke thousands of feet into the sky. It looked like the island itself was burning. He circled once, just to be sure. Nothing moved. Nothing survived. A sense of quiet disbelief filled him. 8 minutes ago, he had been taking photographs. Now he had destroyed an entire air wing. 8 minutes. He turned toward the ocean, the damaged Hellcat trembling with every gust of wind. The adrenaline drained out of him, replaced by a cold, creeping awareness. He had just disobeyed direct orders. A reconnaissance pilot was never meant to attack. His job was to observe, not engage, and yet he had done exactly that: attacked an airfield alone, against everything he'd been taught. Court-martial was a real possibility. So was being grounded, maybe worse. But he also knew something else. If he hadn't acted, those 40 planes would have been airborne by dawn. They would have struck the invasion fleet and turned the beaches into slaughter. He had chosen the only option that made sense. The ocean shimmered ahead, a silver mirror stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there was US Hornet, his home, his lifeline. The Hellcat began to rattle harder. Oil pressure dropped another notch. He wasn't sure how much longer the engine would last. He radioed the carrier tower, voice steady but tired. "Recon flight returning," he said. "Aircraft damaged. Hydraulics failing. Requesting emergency landing." "Copy that, Cowboy," came the reply. "Deck's clear. We're turning into the wind." He exhaled slowly, tightening his harness. The engine coughed once, then steadied. He prayed it would hold just a little longer. 10 minutes later, the Hornet appeared on the horizon, a narrow grey strip cutting through the Pacific. As he approached, he lowered the landing gear. One wheel locked into place. The other didn't. "Of course not," he muttered under his breath. He lined up with the deck, coming in fast too fast, but there was no time to worry. The Hellcat slammed down hard, catching the second arrestor wire. Metal screamed. The impact buckled the landing gear and nearly threw him against the canopy. He killed the throttle and sat motionless for a moment, breathing hard. Then the deck crew swarmed him. The mechanics froze when they saw the damage. The tail section was shredded, the fuselage riddled with holes. The paint was scorched black, streaked with soot. Smoke still curled from the engine cowling. "Holy hell," one crewman muttered. "What did you fly through, a volcano?" Stout climbed out of the cockpit, his legs shaking from fatigue. Officers were already approaching the air boss, the intelligence officer, his squadron commander. Each looked at him like he was a ghost. The air boss spoke first. "Major, you were sent on a reconnaissance flight. Why the combat damage?" Stout removed his helmet, his face streaked with sweat and smoke. "Because the airfield wasn't abandoned, sir." The commander frowned. "Explain." Stout stood straight, meeting their eyes. It was full of aircraft, about 40 of them. All fueled, armed, and preparing for an attack on the invasion fleet. I destroyed them. The intelligence officer blinked. "Destroyed them? How many?" "All of them," Stout said simply. 40 aircraft. 8 minutes, start to finish. The officers exchanged stunned looks. The intelligence officer finally spoke. "You're certain of that number?" Stout nodded once. "I counted." It sounded impossible. But the next morning, the photographs proved him right. The northern airfield at Peleliu was nothing but blackened wreckage. Exactly 40 burned-out Japanese aircraft littered the tarmac. Every single one of them gone. The next morning, when the first reconnaissance planes passed over Peleliu, the truth became undeniable. What had been a sprawling Japanese airfield just 24 hours earlier was now a wasteland of blackened metal and twisted debris. Fuel dumps were nothing but smoking craters. Hangars were flattened into heaps of corrugated iron. Every aircraft lay scorched and broken, the tarmac around them melted into dark pools of tar. Intelligence officers gathered in silence as the photographs came in. The analyst who had insisted the airfield was abandoned now stared at the images, unable to speak. The scale of destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 8 minutes, 40 enemy planes erased. The report reached the carrier group before noon. Within hours, naval intelligence had rewritten its entire assessment of Japanese air strength in the region. The invasion planners adjusted their forecasts. The Marines heading for Peleliu would not face the devastating air assault that command had feared. Instead of 40 Japanese aircraft lying in wait, there would be none. Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout's unauthorized attack had done what an entire bomber squadron might have accomplished, and at exactly the right moment. The news spread quietly across the fleet. Pilots who had flown with Stout gathered on the Hornet's deck to examine the photographs. They didn't cheer or slap him on the back. They just looked at him differently, not as a hothead, but as someone who had done what they all hoped they would have had the courage to do. A few days later, the Navy officially recognized his actions. The citation for the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, read, "For extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty in attacking superior enemy forces alone, Major Stout displayed aggressive fighting spirit and exceptional judgment, resulting in the complete destruction of enemy aircraft poised for offensive action against us forces." The medal was handed to him on the flight deck, the Pacific sun glinting off the gold and blue ribbon. He accepted it quietly, saluted, and returned to duty. There was no speech, no celebration, just the heavy silence of men who understood what the award truly meant. He hadn't won it by following orders. He had earned it by breaking them. 3 days later, on September 15, 1944, the Marines landed on Peleliu. The invasion turned into one of the fiercest and bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Japanese defenders had turned the island's coral ridges and caves into an interlocking fortress. Every inch of ground was contested. Machine gun fire poured from hidden tunnels. Mortar shells rained down from invisible ridgelines. The heat was suffocating, the coral sharp as broken glass beneath their boots. For over 2 months, the battle raged. Nearly 2,000 American lives were lost and 8,000 wounded before the island was finally declared secure. But the skies were silent. Not a single Japanese aircraft attacked the invasion fleet or the landing beaches. The Marines fought and died against entrenched soldiers and snipers, not bombers and strafing runs. Later, historians would estimate that Stout's solo attack had saved between 500 and 1,000 American lives in the first day alone. Those 40 aircraft would have launched waves of strikes against landing craft packed with Marines, against transports loaded with ammunition, against the hospital ships waiting offshore. The losses could have been catastrophic. His 8 minutes of combat had changed the course of the invasion. After the war ended, Robert "Cowboy" Stout went home to California. He was 29 years old. His hair was already streaked with grey at the temples, his hearing permanently dulled by years of engine noise and gunfire. He bought a small house near San Diego, married a nurse he had met during recovery training, and started a family. To the neighbors, he was just another veteran trying to live quietly after the war. Few knew the story that had earned him the Navy Cross. His children grew up knowing only fragments that their father had flown in the Pacific, that he'd served on a carrier, that he had seen some things. The medal itself sat in a drawer for decades, tucked beside old photographs and a logbook whose pages had yellowed with time. Friends described him as calm, humble, and unassuming, a man who preferred listening to speaking, who never bragged about his service. When the subject of the war came up, he would smile faintly and say, "I just did my job." But occasionally, after a drink or two at the local bar, someone would ask him about Peleliu. He would shrug. "I saw planes that needed destroying, so I destroyed them," he'd say. Any pilot would have done the same. Except they knew not every pilot would have. Most would have followed procedure, radioed the coordinates, and let headquarters decide. They would have done what the manual said to do, trusting in the chain of command. Stout hadn't, and because of that, thousands of men got to live. For decades, his story remained little more than a footnote in Navy archives, overshadowed by the larger battles of the Pacific. It wasn't until the late 1980s that military historians rediscovered his mission, while cross-referencing medal citations with Japanese records and aerial photos. What they found stunned them. The Japanese after-action reports confirmed the destruction of the Peleliu airfield exactly as Stout had described it. Aerial imagery from the following day matched his timeline perfectly. The remains of 40 aircraft could be identified, each one scorched, flipped, or torn apart by secondary explosions. Historians realized the full scope of what he had done. One man, one plane, 8 minutes of flight, 40 enemy aircraft destroyed, up to 1,000 lives saved. It was one of the most successful single-pilot missions in the entire war, and yet almost no one outside the Navy's aviation circles had ever heard of it. What made the mission remarkable wasn't just the skill of the flying or the precision of the attack. It was the decision behind it, the instant of moral clarity that separated duty from obedience. In military doctrine, it became an example taught in leadership courses under a single principle: initiative at the tactical level. It's the idea that the person closest to the action often has the clearest understanding of what must be done, even when those above them cannot see it. Stout couldn't have known with certainty that the Japanese planned to launch those aircraft against the invasion fleet. He couldn't know whether attacking would succeed or whether it would end with his plane torn apart before he reached the ground. But he had the judgment, the instinct, and the courage to act when others might have hesitated. To the Navy, that distinction mattered. They didn't court-martial him for disobedience. They honored him for understanding the true intent of his mission, to protect the invasion. Stout had fulfilled that intent perfectly, even if he'd broken every rule to do it. Years later, when his story began to circulate again in tactical training programs, instructors would tell young aviators, he wasn't following orders, he was following purpose. And that, more than anything, defined his legacy. In the end, Robert "Cowboy" Stout's act wasn't just an attack, it was a gamble. He had bet everything on his own instincts. He had guessed at the Japanese plan, trusted his eyes instead of a report, and risked his life and career on a single decision. Everything about the situation screamed for caution. Follow orders. Report back. Let the admirals and intelligence officers decide what to do. That was how the system worked. That was how it was supposed to work. But Stout knew what he was seeing. He knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, an entire fleet was steaming toward Peleliu ships filled with young Marines who trusted the skies would be clear when they arrived. And in that moment, staring down at those 40 fully armed aircraft, he understood something the men behind the maps could not. Sometimes the person in the sky, the one breathing the smoke, seeing the movement, feeling the danger in their guts, sees the truth more clearly than anyone far away. That instinct, that willingness to act when no one told him to, became what military historians later called the purest example of commander's intent. The Navy hadn't ordered him to destroy that airfield, but they had ordered him to protect the invasion force. He understood the difference between instructions and purpose. He knew the mission's intent to ensure that those Marines reached shore alive. When reality changed, he adapted. And that adaptability, that refusal to let the rulebook replace judgment, saved lives. The Navy recognized this after the fact. They could have court-martialed him for disobedience, for risking $1 million aircraft on a one-man attack. But they didn't. They awarded him the Navy Cross instead. They knew that if Stout had followed his orders to the letter, it might have led to catastrophe. His disobedience wasn't a failure of discipline. It was discipline elevated, the highest form of following intent over instruction. Modern fighter pilots still study his mission in tactical leadership training. His 8-minute assault is dissected frame by frame, not just for the flying skill it showed, but for the decision-making under pressure. Instructors use his example to teach a hard truth. Sometimes, following orders exactly means losing the one moment when victory is still possible. Stout's attack wasn't reckless. It was surgical. He didn't waste a single round of ammunition trying to shoot down 40 aircraft one by one. He thought like a tactician, not a gunner. He identified the airfield's weakness, the fuel drums. He knew that a single strike there would do more damage than a dozen perfect runs. One bullet in the right place can accomplish more than 1,000 in the wrong ones. He exploited that vulnerability perfectly. His first pass lit the fuse. His second run, through a storm of gunfire, finished it. Coming in low and fast minimized his exposure to flak and forced the gunners to aim too late. His changing attack angles, his use of the sun's glare to blind defenders, these were not impulsive choices. They were instinctive acts of experience and calculation. Even his withdrawal showed discipline. After expending his last rounds, he didn't circle back to admire the damage or risk a third pass for pride's sake. He turned for the ocean and got out. The mission was complete. Staying longer would have been meaningless. Only ego and luck separated victory from death. All of those choices where to aim, how to approach, when to stop happened in seconds under fire without time for second guessing. Each one proved right. When the war ended, Stout didn't talk about it. He returned home quietly, trading the roar of engines for the hum of ordinary life. In California, he built a small business, raised a family, and rarely mentioned the war. The medal stayed tucked away in a drawer beside his flight log and a worn photo of his squadron on the deck of the Hornet. Those who knew him described a man who smiled easily, but carried something in his eyes, a distance, a gravity. He never sought attention, never corrected people who didn't know his story. When asked about the attack, he'd only say, "I saw planes that needed destroying, so I destroyed them." He believed that any pilot would have done the same. But history knows better. Most would have followed the chain of command, trusted the paperwork, and flown home. Stout didn't. And because he didn't, hundreds, maybe 1,000 Marines made it back alive. Robert Cowboy Stout passed away in 2005 at the age of 89. His children and grandchildren only fully learned the scope of his heroism after his death, when military historians revisited the mission reports and reconnaissance photographs. When the full story emerged, it sounded almost impossible, the kind of tale that belongs in movies, not in archives. But the evidence confirmed every word. The photos showed 40 destroyed aircraft. Japanese records described a sudden, devastating air raid by a single American fighter. The Navy cross-citation matched the timeline exactly. It was all real. One man, one aircraft, 8 minutes of combat, 40 enemy planes destroyed. The invasion fleet saved. No other pilot in World War II destroyed that many aircraft in a single mission. Not one. Today, his name is spoken with quiet respect in aviation schools and officer training programs. His mission has become a symbol of something deeper than bravery, a reminder of the delicate balance between obedience and initiative, between duty and judgment. In war, sometimes the cost of hesitation is greater than the cost of defiance. Stout understood that better than most. He understood that courage wasn't always about fighting the enemy. Sometimes it was about confronting your own fear of being wrong, your fear of breaking the rules and acting anyway. The Marines who stormed Peleliu never knew his name. They never knew that 3 days before their landing, one Navy pilot had seen a threat and refused to let bureaucracy decide their fate. They just saw clear skies, and they survived to fight the real battle waiting on the beaches and coral ridges ahead. And maybe that's how Stout wanted it. No fanfare, no monuments, no interviews, just a simple truth. A man who did what had to be done when the moment demanded it. Because sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't the ones shouted in triumph. They're the ones carried quietly for a lifetime. And somewhere over the Pacific, in those 8 furious minutes of smoke and fire, Major Robert Cowboy Stout earned a kind of immortality that no medal could ever match. The Marines who fought their way up the beaches of Peleliu never knew the name Robert Cowboy Stout. They never saw his aircraft, never read the after-action reports, never knew that one man's decision had cleared the skies above them. They only knew that when the landing craft dropped their ramps, the air was silent. No Zeros screamed down from the clouds. No bombs tore through their landing formations. The sky was theirs. They fought their way inland through coral ridges and smoke, through heat and exhaustion, through caves that burned and reeked of death. But at least they didn't have to look up in terror. At least they didn't face 40 enemy planes strafing them as they tried to reach shore. And that silence, that fragile, priceless silence, was the sound of one pilot's defiance. Sometimes the most heroic act a soldier can commit is to refuse to follow orders, not out of pride, not out of rebellion, but because the moment demands action that rigid obedience cannot deliver. Robert Stout understood this without hesitation. He didn't pause to calculate the consequences. He didn't wait for permission or for command to confirm what his own eyes already told him. He understood something deeper than procedure, that sometimes doing the right thing means stepping beyond the boundaries of what's allowed. He chose the mission over the order. He chose lives over rules. He chose initiative over bureaucracy. And because of that, men who would have died on those beaches went home. Stout's legacy doesn't live in museums or monuments. It lives in classrooms in the way new generations of fighter pilots and officers are taught to think. In nearly every tactical leadership course taught across modern air forces, instructors point to the same lesson. initiative over obedience, adaptation over rigidity, trust in the person closest to the fight. They teach it through simulations, through case studies, through history itself. But at the heart of that lesson is always the same image. One pilot, alone above a jungle island, circling over an airfield, facing a choice that no one else could make for him. That moment, that single act of courage and judgment, became a standard for military ethics across decades. It became a reminder that real leadership isn't about compliance. It's about clarity, seeing what must be done when no one else dares to act. Stout's decision became more than just a wartime story. It became a philosophy. In the years after his death, his mission was incorporated into Navy and Marine Corps training materials. Tactical schools analyzed every second of his attack run, his flight path, his ammunition use, his evasive maneuvers. But what they valued most wasn't the flying, it was the thinking. They studied his ability to process chaos in real time, to see beyond his narrow task and grasp the broader purpose of the mission. He had not simply followed instructions, he had understood intent. That understanding, that link between the mission's spirit and its execution, became what modern militaries call commander's intent. It's the principle that empowers those on the ground or in the cockpit to adapt when the plan no longer fits the reality. Cowboy Stout lived that principle before it was even written down. He didn't see himself as a hero. He never wore the medal, never told his story for fame. But the lesson he left behind still shapes how soldiers, sailors, and pilots are trained today. They are told, there will come a day when the plan breaks down, when you can't ask for permission, when what you see before you contradicts everything written in the briefing. That's when you'll remember Stout, and you'll know what to do. It's not a lesson about defiance, it's about responsibility, about the weight of choice when no one else can bear it for you. Robert Cowboy Stout's name may never appear in every history book, but for those who study leadership, his story remains one of the purest examples of judgment under pressure. He taught the world that courage isn't always about facing the enemy, sometimes it's about facing the system, the rules, the fear of being wrong, and doing what must be done anyway. He knew what needed to happen. He knew what it could cost him if he was wrong, and he did it anyway because the alternative was worse. When you think of him now, don't picture medals or parades. Picture a lone Hellcat streaking over the Pacific sky, smoke curling behind it, sunlight glinting off its wings. Picture a pilot who looked down at a scene of danger and chaos and made a choice that no one else could make for him. That is what heroism looks like. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that simply acts. And as long as men and women are asked to make decisions in moments of uncertainty, as long as courage means seeing clearly when the world turns dark, the spirit of Cowboy Stout will keep flying.